Hi, it's me Jacqueline. Welcome to my channel. If you're new to the channel, then please subscribe my channel and visit my Patreon page, link in the description.
The world can change profoundly in 30 years. Science and technology could make staggering leaps, making available wonders unimagined. Attitudes of prejudice and intolerance could somehow seem to vanish. And the national will of a people could also change decidedly. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened. Where people once had been blasé and dismissive of space exploration, it now seemed to capture everyone's imagination. Everyone followed the news of America's lunar colony and the 3 orbital space platforms of China, Russia, and America. Once again, space was king. And leading the charge was Mars Expedition 1. The expedition was much grander than the original advocates of a Mars mission ever envisioned. A transfer vehicle with 2 landing craft powered by a Vasimer nuclear motor had been built in orbit. The 40-megawatt engine cut the travel time to Mars from a planned 9 months to less than 4. And the expedition mounted not 1 lander, but 2, each with 6 astronauts and a payload of equipment and supplies. These landers would serve as the first components of a permanent base on the Red Planet. Humanity was coming to stay. And yet, despite profound change, some things just seem eternal. For instance, a certain neighborhood within the city managed to retain its unique flavor despite the passage of time. True, the inhabitants of this neighborhood could not escape the inevitable onslaught of the years. They accumulated their fair share of wrinkles, aches, and hair loss. Children grew old and had children of their own. But the essential character of the neighborhood survived. Children could still play hopscotch and jump rope on the sidewalks, protected from any harm by the patient supervision of their neighbors. One could still walk into the curious and wonderful shops owned and operated by neighbors. And one could still get the best Reuben in the known universe at Bob's Cyber Cafe. It was on a very special afternoon that the neighbors all gathered inside Bob's. They had come to cheer one of their own as she made history millions of miles away. Bob looked much the same as always, with the addition of some wrinkles and gray hairs. He was bringing some milk and cookies over to the children's table, where 3 little girls and a pair of twin boys were riveted to the computer screen. "So are you kids excited?" he asked. "You bet, Uncle Bob," one of the boys answered. "Mommy's gonna land on Mars today." Bob looked at the 2 red-headed boys, Mitch and Chuck. Their mother had left over 4 months ago, but they managed to keep in touch with video messages every day. As Bob watched, he was reminded of a day, many years ago, when a tall red-haired meter maid fainted in front of his cafe. He brought her in, gave her a diet soda and a sandwich, and set in motion a chain of events that led to this momentous day. A petite blonde waitress, Misty, interrupted his musing. "Hey boss, Doc and Nancy both want Reubens a la Bob. Can you fix them up?" "Sure thing," said Bob. He looked up at the crowd that had gathered. In one booth, Dr. Travis Dupree and his lovely wife, Nancy, sat with Nora Griscom, née Spencer, and her husband Mike. Nora's teenage daughter Rachel was waiting tables for Bob, and her younger daughter Madeline was seated at the children's table. Bob walked over to chat. "Can you believe it?" he asked. "Our little kitten is landing on Mars today." "I envy her," Nora said. "You don't know how much I wanted to go into space." "I am so glad she realized her dream." "So am I," said Nancy. "I can't believe this is the same little girl Shelley would bring in for checkups and shots and skinned elbows. I'll bet Shelley is proud of her." Shelley was sitting with her sister Jenna and Jenna's 2 grown daughters, Becky and Kathleen. They were enjoying some muffins and tea along with Maggie's husband, Mark Flannery, and Kathleen's husband, Frank Scanlon. "How hard has it been handling the boys without their mother?" asked Jenna. "Oh, it hasn't been too bad," Mark replied. "Besides, I got a lot of help from their grandmom." "It was a pleasure," Mark said Shelley. "I get to spoil them and then hand them back to you for baths and bedtime. If I knew that being the grandmother was this much fun, I would have done it first." "The boys love you, Shelley. I'm glad you can watch them when I'm at work." Just then a voice sounded out. It was Alex. "Hey folks, I'm getting the NASA feed now. Everybody check it out on their monitors." Millions of miles away, Maggie had her hands full. The feed was delayed several minutes, thanks to the inevitable lag of radio propagation. Data could move through space at the speed of light and no faster. So the cheering from Earth would happen a few minutes after the actual landing. Right now, this did not matter one bit to Maggie. Her hands were on the controls of the lander as it plunged through the tenuous Martian atmosphere. 6 souls were literally in her hands, her own and the crew of the lander. Houston, attitude nominal. We are in position to deploy the chute. She did not wait for acknowledgement, since the answer would take minutes to receive. She had to rely on her own judgment, her training, and the mission profile. She flicked a switch on the panel. Outside, the hypersonic parachute was propelled out of its canister, capturing the thin air of Mars in its folds. It unfolded with a sharp snap, rapidly decelerating the lander. Maggie still had some control over the flight. The chute was, for all intents and purposes, an inflatable wing, and aerodynamic control could be exercised via the shroud lines. "Maggie, I have positive contact with the probe," said Joyce Aiken, her crewmate. "We are on nominal glide slope for landing." "Confirmed," said Jeff Franklin, her co-pilot. "Looks like we're right in the slot, Skipper." "Acknowledged, guys," Maggie said. "Let's stay sharp. We don't want to screw the pooch when we're this close." She worked the controls while alternating her attention between the bank of instruments and her own view. The lander was oriented so that she had a limited direct view from her window. For landing, she would have to rely on the instruments and the rear-looking camera. She had made this run many times in the simulator and killed her virtual crew more than once. But now she felt confident. "We are over the landing site. Preparing to cut lines for final descent. On my mark. 3, 2, 1, cut." Jeff flipped the line switch and the lander fell free, pulled down by a gravity that was slightly more than a third of the Earth's. Now Maggie moved her hand to the throttle at her side and advanced it. Landing motor to 50%. Landing motor to 70%. Full thrust. The lander vibrated under the thrust of the motor. Its speed dropped to 0. Maggie read her instruments and reduced thrust. Slowly, the lander dropped to the surface, writing fire in the Martian sky. "Contact light on," Jeff announced. A probe that extended from one of the landing pads had touched the surface. "Acknowledged," Maggie said. Shutting motor off. She pulled the throttle back, turning off the supply of fuel to the motor. With no force to oppose it, the lander dropped the last meter, bouncing slightly as the shock absorbers actuated. "Houston," said Maggie, keying her mic to transmit, Olympus base reporting. "Challenger has landed." Challenger was the name chosen by the crew. It was almost rejected by NASA, who did not wish to invoke the name of one of its most notorious disasters, but the crew would not accept any other name. Likewise, the second lander bore the name Columbia, and each lander had the name of the fallen shuttle astronauts emblazoned on its skin. As news of the landing reached Earth, boisterous cheers rang out. Mission Control in Houston temporarily looked the other way on its smoking ban as cigars were passed around and fired up. But in the lander now resting on Olympus Rupees, just southeast of Olympus Mons, there was only a sigh as 6 nervous souls relaxed for the first time in hours. "Okay, people," said Maggie, "let's go down the checklist. We now have a rest period and go EVA in 6 hours. Then Jeff, Lenny, and I will make our way down the ladder and step off together." That's when she noticed a conspiratorial wink being exchanged between her crewmates. Jeff spoke up. "Skipper, we took a vote, and we decided that there can only be one first person on Mars. And we also decided that it has to be you." Maggie looked at her crew in disbelief. "Look, you know the rules. No solo EVAs. There has to be at least 2 people out at any time, and the landing protocol calls for 3 of us to go together for the first trip out. And we're going to be right behind you," Jeff replied. "But none of this stepping off together bull. Think about it. How will history know who spoke the first words on Mars if 3 people talk at once? You go first, Thundercat. You earned it." Maggie was taken aback when Jeff used her old call sign. They had flown together during their early days as test pilots and knew each other's call sign well. NASA didn't use call signs. Jeff continued to press. "Go ahead, Mags. We'll be right behind you. Go plant the flag and say something profound. Besides, it'll give us a head start to get back in the lander when the Tharks grab you first." Maggie just had to laugh at Jeff's reference to Burroughs' character from the early 20th century. All right, she said. I won't argue. But what am I going to say? You'll think of something as you suit up. So let's get going. What, right now? We're supposed to take a rest break before EVA. For crying in a bucket, Maggie, we just landed on Mars. Do you really think we're going to be able to sleep? I sure can't. So let's go work up a sweat and get tired enough to rack out for real. This is mutiny, you know, she said. So court-martial us when we get back to Earth. Now suit up. Maggie gave up arguing. She made her way down to the habitation ring of the lander where the airlock was located and the EVA suits were stored, along with Jeff Franklin and Leonard Brown, her crewmates. As they helped each other get into the EVA suits, her thoughts turned back to a day over 30 years ago, when a tall, skinny TS meter maid with thinning hair found her way into a certain cyber cafe back on Earth, where her life took a dramatic change. She remembered how she had been transformed into a little girl and started her life over as the daughter of a witch, Shelley Shalimar. Shelley had given Maggie a special tea to make her forget her former life, but the effects of the tea wore off over time and the memories returned. No matter, she thought as she adjusted the fecal containment unit about her waist and pulled on the thermal regulating underwear. She had been given a marvelous opportunity to do life over, and this time she had discovered the secret. It really wasn't all that difficult. We just need to keep that child inside of us all alive. For while Maggie might have grown to adulthood, she never lost that sense of wide-eyed wonderment and playful eagerness every child has. She felt sorry for those who suppressed their inner child, much as she had many years ago, for they approached the world with a jaded cynicism. So much better to be a child, where every experience is new and fresh and every day is a joyful one. The three astronauts had now completely suited up and entered the airlock. Jeff worked the controls to cycle the air out of the chamber, equalizing the pressure with the thin atmosphere of Mars. The hatch opened, and human eyes beheld the Martian landscape for the first time. Maggie stepped forward. She turned and climbed down the ladder, her crewmates still at the top, and made her way to the footpad. Last chance, guys, she called up. Are you sure you don't want to share this with me? We're sure, Skipper, said Lenny. Hey, it never hurt Buzz Aldrin, did it? Maggie said, no, I suppose not. Then she turned and looked out over the landscape. They had landed at Olympus Rupees, a scarp just southwest of Olympus Mons, the tallest mountain known to man in the solar system. The view was magnificent and just a little bit overwhelming. As she stood at the footpad, Maggie stretched forth with her senses the way her mother Shelley had taught her. Wouldn't it just scare the pants off a few people at NASA if they knew that their star astronaut was also a full-fledged witch? But Maggie had continued her magical training under Shelley's expert tutelage, just as she studied and mastered the arcane arts of physics, chemistry, mathematics, and thermodynamics. After all, what was magic if not another kind of technology? There it was. She could sense it. The power was there. She knew that this new planet would be a welcome haven for the human race. Now was the time. Humanity was holding its collective breath as she stood on the footpad. Oh, Lord, she said to the people listening back on Earth, I wish I were a poet so I could do justice to what I'm now seeing. I can see Olympus Mons just to the right of me. The sun is low in the sky, and the sky is pink. The ground has a rusty sort of tinge to it, and the ground seems to be littered with rocks of various sizes. Okay, I'm stepping off the pad. She stepped forward, and her boot hit the regolith of Mars. This is for all the children of the world, that they may touch the stars. Back on Earth, in millions of gathering places all over the globe, a cheer emerged that was heard around the world. People of every land, in every language, cheered and offered prayers of thanks. And perhaps it was loudest at a certain cyber cafe in a certain neighborhood of a certain city that Maggie called home. Already millions of journalists recorded her words, preserving them for posterity. The flickering video images would be archived in the vaults of history and forever etched in the minds of all who witnessed them. For decades, people would stop and ask others, what were you doing when? It had become a defining moment for humanity, and Maggie's words were now forever associated with it. For with those words, Colonel Mary Margaret O'Malley, test pilot, astronaut and mother of twin boys, became the first human being to set foot on the planet Mars.
Please subscribe for the next part and visit my Patreon page for early access.